ready and excited for you to start. Jo de Baerdemaeker. I hope I'm pronouncing it the right way.
Very well.
Yes, for anyone who doesn't know it by now, is an independent Belgian typeface designer and researcher. He holds an MA and a PhD from the University of Reading in the UK. His interests are designing, researching, and writing about WorldScript typefaces and multilingual typography. He's a regular speaker at international conferences and curates exhibitions centered on type and typography. And he's currently teaching at the LUCA School of Arts in Ghent. And we are gathered here today because he's the author of Tibetan Typeforms, which we all strongly recommend. It's the first and so far the only book of in-depth Tibetan type and typography research. And we're very, very excited to learn more about this research from you, Jo.
Thank you, Shawnee, for this amazing introduction. I'm very thankful and happy that I'm able to talk here for you, the Rochester Institute of Technology and the Calligraphic Arts Collection. I'm very pleased that I can share the research and introduce the book on Tibetan Typeforms with you all. Just to make it clear to everyone, it's going to be a very general talk today. So because I didn't know the scope of the audience and the background, so there's a lot of images that I will go through. It's going to be more informal, but feel free to shoot any questions at the end of the talk, and I'm more than happy to answer more deeper or more expandedly about any of the topics. Also after the talk or when the time is finished, I'm happy to answer more or send more resources or share information by email or anything. So feel free to this. But thank you everyone for taking time out for listening to this talk. I'm going to talk about Tibetan typefaces and more specifically Tibetan printing types, because it's already quite a large group to cover in this talk. And Tibetan language is actually used in this part of the world. I'll briefly give an overview from Google. It's centered around the Himalayas in a region which is formerly known as Tibetan, now known as a Tibetan Autonomous Region, but also a large part of Nepal, Bhutan, India, like Sikkim and Ladakh is using the Tibetan language and script in its regions, and also parts of the diaspora. But of course, it's also spread around the world, and lots of international libraries and collections are also making use of Tibetan scripts to transliterate work. So that's why Tibetan is a little bit used around the world, so to speak. In general, we can say that it's about 7 million native speakers. You can see Tibetan mainly being used as manuscripts, like the cases you see here, so handwriting on different kinds of paper, or like also paper made from trees and floral elements. It's also used in the form of xylographs, which are wood block engravings. Actually, lots of the Buddhist canon or the texts are engraved in this long pecha style long leaf wood blocks, which are carved on both sides of the wood block. But it's also engraved in stone and also lettered on boulders or other like environmental kind of structures. So in sense, although that I'll be talking about Tibetan printing types in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, from as Tibet, they never used printing types themselves. So the development was actually happened outside Asia for the Tibetan script, and more specifically, the first Tibetan typeface was developed in Rome for the Sacra Congregatio de Propaganda Fide press, which is actually used to translate religious texts and in order to translate the Bible into different languages of the world. And the first Tibetan writing system, printing type for Tibetan was manufactured in 1738. So you can see that it's about 3 centuries later than the development of Western printing or that Western typography. Mainly because other writing systems other than Latin or Greek or Cyrillic, which were more used than Tibetan, gained like, how should you say, the first other printing types to be developed other than Tibetan, because it's not that many people using it at the time. Tibetan script or language was actually existed in the 7th century, was invented then, based on Abrahamic derived Northern India script. And here you can see the example of one of the first books printed with this large size printing type for the Tibetan script. It was designed by Antonio Fantuzzi in 1738, and although the intention was to translate the Bible, the propaganda press almost never translated the Bible in Tibetan, but first linguistic works were manufactured, like the Alphabetum Tibetanum in 1759, 1762, and 1773. Now, the Tibetan writing system is not an alphabet, it's a syllabary, and it makes use of visualizing syllables. And they write from left to right. And like Indian writing systems, they compose the different syllables by stacking some of the base characters vertically underneath each other. And that already proved quite a difficulty in the early printing types. Also Fantuzzi, who developed the first type that you can see here, he actually made use of just stacking each of the individual characters underneath each other. And this resulted in very big gaps between consecutive lines. Also, the first printing type for Tibetan was a very large size. It was very coarse, so it was not very beautifully designed. And even today, some of the characters are very hard to decipher. And on the right side of this page, you can see that especially in multilingual typography, the Tibetan typeface was very dominant. It was very large in comparison to the other writing systems on that same page. If you compare it with the Latin, also the Chinese and also the Mongolian that's on the same page, it's really like very hard to typeset with the Tibetan. So typesetters at the time were having definitely a hard time to compose this kind of pages. The printing type was mainly used for setting like linguistic work at the first, and also to translate parts of the Lords of Prayer, the Oratio Dominica, which are parts of a section of the Christian literature translated in different languages and writing systems of the world. So on the right-hand side, you can see a specimen of a type specimen book of the Propaganda Fide Press, which displays like parts of the translation in 3 different writing systems, on which the Tibetane is on the bottom part. There still exists some original material from this first and quite old printing type, and the material, especially the punches, are housed in the archives of the Imprimerie Nationale in Paris. And how came that these printing types are stored there? That has to do with the fact that when Napoleon was reigning Europe, he actually confiscated quite a lot of printing equipment from the different printing houses all over Europe and brought it back to France to be stored there. And up until today, still the original punches of the Fantuzzi type are still preserved in these archives. They were never returned. Here you can see some examples of these punches to give an indication of the size. And you can already see that some of the characters were cast cut individually, and some of the syllables he also tried to, should I say, cut into one single punch to facilitate the vertical typesetting, but not with good success. This coarse and very rudimentary printing type was actually a resource for a long time to come, and also important punch cutters and type designers, like, as you can read here on this page, Giambattista Bodoni, made use of this first printing type for Tibetan to model his own two typefaces for his type foundry on that very crude and geometric typeface. So although it's not legible, and Bodoni never could read Tibetan, of course, he just copied what was already available at the Propaganda Fide press. And how came it that Giambattista Bodoni actually had access to it? It was his grandfather, who was a typesetter, compositor in the letterpress compositors room of the Propaganda Fide press. And he actually, now I'm talking about Bodoni, often visited that archive, and he also learned the skill of typesetting there, and often was cleaning like the different parts of the composing room and got access to this collection of printing types for different writing systems of the world. So that's how he got access to this model. Also, for one of the first dictionaries that were manufactured in India for the Serampore press was based on the availability over the spread of the typeface of Fantuzzi, and Manohar, who was the assistant of Panchanan, the punch cutter of the Serampore press, based his own smaller size printing type for printing the dictionary of the Botan language, which it's a bit double. It can be the language of Bhutan, which also uses the Tibetan script for their Dzongkha language. But Bota also is a translation of Boat, which is from Tibet. So in that sense, it's not clear where the translations come from. So it can be the double meaning. But also here, the very crude and not well-designed characters were used as a model for this printing of the first dictionary. It was only when academic institutions evolved and linguistics was developed all over the world, not only in Europe, but also in other regions like Russia and India, so that there was a need for translations of the original text into the native tongue in which that the translation had to be done, that there was some improvements being made for Tibetan printing types. And one of the first ones was done by Alexandra Choma de Kuros. He was a Hungarian linguist who traveled around the Himalayas in order to translate dictionaries and grammars book from Tibetan into German, also into English, and so on. And he actually he came in contact with a lot of nomads in that region, and he actually learned the writing system, Tibetan himself. And the typeface that you can see here that was printed for this grammar book was based on his own writing. So within the dictionary, you can also see some lithographed pages, which he used as a model of his own handwriting. So it was not based on this existing typeface anymore, but originated from original resources. Also, the Academy of Sciences Press in St. Petersburg, who was very important in the development and spread of Tibetan studies in Europe, also based the typefaces that were designed for printing the linguistic work of Isaac Jacob Schmidt by making use of models that were housed in their collections of Tibetan manuscripts and woodblocks in the Academy of Sciences of St. Petersburg. And this is definitely a better improvement than the earlier examples that you can see. It was more precisely designed, the proportions were well maintained, and I'm not going to talk into the very principles in the harmony or proportions of the individual characters, because it's something for another talk. It's this specific typeface that actually was well received not only in Russia, but all over the world. What is important is that for the first time, 2 different sizes were made. And they had to really be used for setting academic multilingual texts, works, I have to say. And one impressive work is this encyclopedia. It's a Buddhist encyclopedia in 4 different languages. One is Mongolian, vertically written. The other is Cyrillic, Russian. Then the third one is French translation. And the fourth one that you can see here as well is Tibetan. But what's difficult here, and even today with contemporary word processing software and the accessibility of well designed and technologically qualitative functioning fonts, it's very difficult to replicate this encyclopedia that was made in Kazan, Russian capital, sorry, a Russian city, with a large university that made this multilingual encyclopedia work. So it's a very impressive work, and if you have a chance to see this in person, I really would recommend browsing to it because it's very, very impressive. But what's more important is that the type specimen book from the Academy of Sciences printing press of St. Petersburg has a large collection of each of the printing types that they actually produced. And they did not only produce just the printed examples from the text, they also were one of the first to actually print the whole synopsis of individual sorts and punches that were actually produced for the individual typefaces. So to give an idea or to give an impression, to come up with a glyph set for designing Tibetan fonts today, this would be one good resource to check or to double check to see how many glyphs would be needed in order to compose a Tibetan text with Tibetan, valuable Tibetan syllabary. In France, the Imprimerie Nationale, I was saying already, they were also developing a lot of printing works for the academic world. And Marcelin Legrand, also a linguist, sorry, a punch cutter who cut a lot of printing types for linguists, for instance, Arabic, Maghribi, and other printing types. Also designed 3 different sizes for a Tibetan printing type. And that was actually done to translate and print the work of Foucault and other French Tibetan linguists. Marcelin Legrand was very familiar with the work from St. Petersburg. And if you look closely to the punches, which are again in the archives of the Imprimerie Nationale, you can see the very refined hairlines, the very refined modulation, which is almost identical to the printing types in Russia. Again, also Marcelin Legrand would never be able to read or write Tibetan. He would just base the sources in order to copy the design of the individual characters from. But another aspect that is very interesting and valuable as a researcher to study and to see here in the archives of the Imprimerie Nationale is that they also have the different layouts of the cases where the individual sorts for the printing types were preserved. And it's these wooden cases that were actually used by the different compositors or type setters in the composing room from the printing presses all over France, but also Germany, India, you name everywhere. And most, probably and more likely, those typesetters, they were not very literate. They could recognize the shapes. So they had to memorize the order in which the different characters were located in the different compartments, and they were just taking the different sorts out of these wooden cases to typeset the text for the linguists or other printers. And those were then actually read and corrected by the linguists themselves, and they came back to the compositing room to make the individual changes. But the work of Marcelin Legrand is also well received. So in that sense, it's a faithful interpretation, I have to say, of the work of the typefaces from Russia. But it's a good quality typeface, and it's still very well maintained today. The first display type, like a bolder version to mainly set larger pieces of text, was made by Gustav Schelter. Gustav Schelter was punch cutter in Germany, and he provided the printing type for the linguistic work of Friedrich Ballhorn. Ballhorn was a linguist who came up with a lot of academic work which compared all the different writing systems of the world in one single book or single work. So it's called Alphabete orientalischer und occidentalischer Sprache. And it's really to show to all the different academics and also linguists the use of the different writing systems and comparisons, how they are made linguistically. And in that sense, most of the typefaces that you can see in his work are large size printing types. The typeface from Schelter was distributed all over Europe, also to London. And the right-hand side of this page, you can see an example from a printing type specimen from Gilbert and Rivington in London, who also used this typeface to typeset various large size pieces, transliterations of Bible texts or anything else. A second polyglot printing house, and with polyglot printing house, I refer to actually the few large printing houses in Europe that actually possessed a lot of printing types for different writing systems. Was one from Alois Auer for the Viennese composing or printing house of the Kaiserliche und Königliche Hof- und Staatsdruckerei in Vienna, which is really like the national printer for Vienna, basically. But what did Alois Auer do? Like Marcelin Legrand and like, for instance, Bodoni, he based himself on existing typefaces. What he actually wanted to do, he wanted to have like a demonstration of the accessibility of all the different printing types that were manufactured all over Europe and reproduce them. So in that sense, there's not really like originality here. They were just copies, and like sometimes today, copyright was not an issue at that time in Europe. So especially for lots of different writing systems, they just used existing ones and copied the needs of this. He also produced two smaller sizes from it, but what is again more essential here is that, and that's in terms of manufacturing metal printing types, is that Auer came up with his own type casting system. And the chart here that you can see is like part of a large type specimen book, which you can have access to in the St. Bright Printing Library in London, in which he explains the different ways of how to cast the individual parts of the Tibetan syllabary. Not to make it more complicated, I can give more explanation to it later if you want. But also the polyglot or multilingual printing house of Stephen Austin and Sons, who were actually printers for the Royal Asiatic Society and also the East Indian Company College. Stephen Austin and Sons, that printing house got access to a printing type from Auer. Well, Auer actually delivered the Tibetan printing type. So, which you can see here in the middle of this advertisement, to demonstrate that they can actually print in a multitude of languages all over the world. So here too, you can see that although it's not the best quality, the typefaces of Auer were distributed also around Europe, from Vienna to London, and more than this. The list of type specimens for or printing types for Tibetan that you can see listed here, they are actually more or less copies from one another. So not really original designs, apart from the one from Isaac Jacob Schmidt in St. Peter, used material from the library and collection museum in St. Petersburg. And they were regarded by many linguists of the 19th century as very hard to read, even monstrous examples of specimens for the Tibetan language. It's only by the linguist and the lexicographer Heinrich August Jeschke that there was the biggest improvement being made. And he was in touch with a lot of other linguists, and for instance, Karel Richard Lepsius, who was an Egyptologist. And the first time that he actually ordered or to produce a new Tibetan printing type was to print the communications that Lepsius and Jeschke had with each other in regards to discussing improvements of the grammar books, improvements of the dictionaries for these different writing systems of the world. The typeface that was produced was ordered by Lepsius and Jeschke, and it was manufactured for the Rijksdrukkerij in Berlin. We don't really know who actually cut the punches. It's still a little bit uncertain. Some sources might say that it might be already Teinhardt, but sources say that it's not possible because it was 20 years done before the typeface that he would become, Tibetan typeface that would become the most famous all over the world. But what is very interesting here is that it's also kind of a copy of the one from St. Petersburg, like the large style of the St. Petersburg typefaces. So in that sense, Jeschke said it's not a good imitation, but it's already better than all of the other types that are existing. But very recently, the punches were discovered of this unique printing type of the Rijksdrukkerij, and these can be studied and researched in the Technikmuseum in Berlin, together with other punches from renowned Berlin and German punch cutters. So that's a very valuable resource to have at the moment. It's actually Ferdinand Teinhardt, which I already introduced a little bit a moment ago, who actually developed a very elegant and a very precise and a very well-proportioned printing type for the Tibetan script. He actually was asked by Jeschke to produce this printing type for a dictionary that Jeschke was actually compiling. And he made two sizes of the printing type. You can see a body size for like the text within the dictionary, and also like the display type size in a little bit larger size to actually put the different characters for the different sections of the dictionary. Now, to not make it too complicated, Jeschke was in touch with the printing house of the Unger brothers in Berlin. And the Unger brothers became also a large polyglot printing house. And they were in touch with the British Foreign Bible Society. So they got the order to produce the translations, to produce and print the translations of the Bible in Tibetan. And they actually used Teinhardt's typeface to do this. So it was a little bit developed both for the printing type, for the dictionary for Jeschke, but also for the first printed Bible translations in Tibetan. And you can already see here that Teinhardt mentions in his, should I say, autobiography a little bit. It's Mein Dienstleben, which is, he narrates a little bit about what he has done in his personal life, what kind of jobs that he did. And he mentions that he made use of a manuscript, which was in the archives of the museum. In his autobiography, he writes that it's a 3,000-year-old manuscript, but that's not possible because Tibetan language was only invented in the 7th century AD. So I presume that it's a 300-year-old, century-old manuscript. But still, you can see that he actually took a very good resource as a model, and basically, like his other writing systems for which he designed typefaces, he really executed well. Now, I have to make like one footnote. The name of Ferdinand Teinhardt might be associated for many Western typeface designers with designing early sans serif typefaces. So in that sense, he was already well, how should I say, well experienced in designing printing types and cutting punctions. So in that sense, his eye for detail and elegance, in my eyes, he also put into the development of cutting punches for the other writing systems that he did. And even if you see the printed pages of his type specimen books, or even the translations of the Bible text, or even in this case, more complicated Buddhist transliterations with his printing type, it was very well regarded, and even today regarded as one of the high quality typefaces. And also the Oxford University Press, and more precisely Horace Hart, who was also a perfectionist in terms of how the printing office should operate, and he always was looking for the best quality in terms of printing types, paperwork, and you name it. He also had the attention of the typeface that Ferdinand Teinhardt cut. So here is some correspondence with Teinhardt that Horace Hart had in order to recast the typeface and to order new matrices to make printing sorts, like the sorts for which would match the printing presses from England, because they have a different type height than the one from Germany, to make it short. I can explain it a little bit later. So that's why this is a chart which is also in the Technique Museum of Berlin, which explains by Teinhardt, because most probably it's his handwriting, the way or the calculations in order to recast the individual parts of the Tibetan syllable for England. And you can see here on the top of this large chart that it's a document which was specifically made for Horace Hart. The printing specimens of Oxford display everything very well. However, the casely that Teinhardt proposed was not very suited for Horace Hart, so he came up with a new kind of layout for all the different packages of type which were distributed to the different printing presses, with a more, how should I say this, less complicated, so more direct and straightforward layout. Now, the Oxford University Press also made a smaller version of this Tibetan printing type, and that they actually did by the process of electrolysis. So it's like a mechanical device. Well, it's to do with electrolysis and yeah, with using existing type and then making new sorts and matrices from reducing or enlarging this type mechanically. So it's not that this two-line brevet Tibetan, which is the smaller size you see here on the page, was hand-cut, but it was done by a mechanical system. And here you can see the matrices, which were actually made by means of this electrolysis system. These are preserved in the Oxford University archives. But Teinhardt's typeface was not only distributed in Germany, like you can see some of the listed printing houses here, or in Europe, like for instance, London, like Gilbert Rivington, Oxford University Press. It was also distributed to Vienna, to the Netherlands in Leiden, to Rome, to Madrid, even in India. It's like a number of printing houses that actually use this newly elegant typeface all over the world. And also in China, Hong Kong, and Japan, the typeface was, became throughout used, ubiquitously. I cannot pronounce it properly, but it's really all over. So you could actually say that it's like the Times New Roman typeface for Tibetan, because it's so distributed all over, and also that Tibetan works were printed with this typeface. Here you can see some examples. Here is a collection of, again, matrices, which is from Drugolin, and which are in Darmstadt, in the Hessische Landesmuseum, preserved there, also to cast the individual swords there. And some examples of printed pages in polyglot or multilingual publications from Kyoto. I was lucky to actually handle the metal types myself, so the swords that were cast from it, which were housed not only in the archives of the St. Bright Library in London, but also in the British Library of London. So with the help of Burkhard Kessel, I was able to actually study the way that the composition was done. But unfortunately, not all the cases were well maintained, so they were in disorder. Luckily, I had like the case lays that were on the packages to actually resort them again. And I developed the case lays which were then distributed back with the original type cases. But what is very helpful here was actually not only to see how the composing was done. So I actually hand set the different, 3 different printing types by hand to produce a type specimen from each with the individual, the same text that was typeset in the 3 printing types, but also the synopsis, like the St. Petersburg Academy Press did earlier, to see how many individual punches were actually made to do this. And here I could actually firsthand see how it was done. In a sense, it was also used for many Indian writing systems. So printing types for instance, Devanagari, Bengali, Gujarati. And on the left-hand side, you can see a diagram that was made for the typography of Devanagari from Bapurao Naik. And it explains like the degree type composition system. And you can compare it with like compiling a mosaic. So the typeface from Ferdinand Teinhardt made use of this exact system. So they actually, to compose a syllable, like each of the individual parts of the syllable for Tibetan, they actually had to typeset each of the individual parts, like the mosaic parts, and compile it all together. So depending on if a Tibetan syllable had a subscript, a suprascript, or a superscript, or a vowel sign positioned underneath, there was a different way of actually bearding off the individual syllable. So on the left-hand side, you see the full body, which was the type size of 14 or 17 point size done. But if you had to typeset a syllable with a vowel underneath, you had to use a different kind of sort, combine it with another one. And each of these individual, how should I say, packages was actually sold to the individual printing presses, and it came in these packages to see how it was done. On the right-hand side, you can see, it's better here, how it explains to the compositors or the individual typesetter where each of the individual syllable combinations had to be located in the case lay. And here it explains, and I'll go quickly back to a different slide earlier, whether it's the full body syllable or whether it's like the one on which an element had to be positioned on top of it or below. So that's how it's called bearded off on top, bearded off on bottom. So it means that the full body was cut a little bit. However, there was also the existence of a more easier and user-friendly, I have to say, compositing system, and that's the Ghent type system that was also in use in India and other like Asian countries. And this typesetting method makes use of shoulders. That's the translation of Ghent is shoulder. And in this case, you can see the Tibetan typesetting, a close-up of what I did is that parts of the syllable was not composed as individual mosaic tiles, but it overlaps and it clicks into each other. So the lines of text would interlock and the individual parts of sorts would not easily fall on the floor. So it's more easily to connect. So in that sense, the whole sword is halved lengthwise and then depending on which syllable you had to compose, you could choose the one that needs to interlock with the consecutive one. I was just talking about the developments in Europe, but also, of course, in other regions in the world, there were some Tibetan printing types that were made. One important one was done by Sarat Chandra Das, an Indian linguist who also composed a revised edition of Tibetan English Dictionary, and thus also used some original manuscripts to produce a new printing type. And this was done for the Bengal Secretariat Press, so in the neighborhood of Calcutta, East India, just to be precise. He also put a lot of attention in designing punches for numerals, and that's something that I did not put the focus on this talk here, but it's also very interesting to see how the development of printing types or punches, glyphs for the numerals evolved throughout time. But also in Beijing, quite a lot of Tibetan printing types were made. Well, quite a lot, I have to say. In that sense, it's not only until late in the 1960s that China produced printing types for the Tibetan script, and that was mainly done for the publications that Chairman Mao Zedong was actually producing, and especially for his 1964 first publication of his quotations, in which he actually uses different quotes from very easy, straightforward strategies and political visions that he translated in the different languages from the world, that he translated from Chinese into the different writing systems, that he also developed not less than 6 different printing types for the Tibetan script to publish his works. So here you can see some examples of this pocket-sized book that was one of the, and in the history of printing books, it's one of the most widely printed books all over the world. I've got numbers here that say from this specific quotation, there's been printed 1 billion copies of it, and from another kind of later version about 50 million different aspects. So it's also very well known. But what is fascinating here, and I had luckily the opportunity to visit the printing museum in Beijing, in which they house quite a lot of equipment and publications from this, is that he also devised different Tibetan printing types for displaying titles. And especially the one that you see on the right-hand side, it's Mao 4, number 4. Well, in the research, I named each of the different printing types according to the publications or the punch cutters that was on. Is that it's a style of Tibetan printing time that's especially seen in the People's Republic of China. And in that sense, it's a high contrast Tibetan printing type, in which you can see a very large modulation between the thick parts and the thin parts. And in a sense, it's also a little bit compressed horizontally. And it's one of the, and it's on the top pages that you can see it here. And here is like a zoom or like a detailed. And even now in seeing contemporary publications of Tibetan text in the People's Republic of China, you can see that this specific style is favored for display type and for titles. Although that it was made for Mao's publications, it's the Foreign Languages Press, to be more precise, who printed and distributed the work. And the Wenzi factory from Shanghai was also able to produce and make a printing type from one of the Mao printing types and distribute it individually for commercial use. Now, I have to admit that regarding the photo typesetting area in China, a lot of research still needs to be done, and it's quite difficult to get access to the whole photo type area. But the reason is that lots of the publications are also in Chinese, and not a lot of it is available in English translations. But having said this, is that it's actually to introduce that Tibetan fonts have been developed for phototype, but never have been developed for monotype or linotype publications. But there were other devices, mechanical type devices, for which Tibetan types were made. Here you can see a Verityper, one of the earliest typewriter systems, which makes use of like rounded, they even call it type fonts, which are positioned on the round device on top of this typewriter system. But they had a large collection of typewriter fonts for writing systems of the world, for instance, the Devanagari, Punjabi, you can see here, and also a Tibetan. But unfortunately, they never devised their own keyboard layout. They had to use like the Western Latin-based keyboard in order to map each of the different keys for the Tibetan writing system. So they had to come up with a device of like shifting the keys into different locations in order to typeset the different parts of the Tibetan syllable. So you had to add a backspace back, and then the second part of the syllable can be written by it, and so forth and so on. So here's like an explanation how very deep syllables can be positioned. An example of some text here. Now, again, because it's a mechanical device which needs to go through an inked-in ribbon, you can see the more monolinear style of a Tibetan printing type. And one of the pioneers to actually make a more electronic device or Tibetan typewriter was Mr. Narkit, who is regarded as the father of the Tibetan typewriter, and he used the Remington typewriter device to come up with like a Tibetan variation of it. Originally, it was done for the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala, and all of the educational work to learn the language and script of Tibetan for students all over the world was actually done, so it was well known. You can see some of the keys was typeset with this typewriter, and in this case, there's not one single typewriter being manufactured, but Remington actually produced, that was like in 1977, an order of 100 different typewriters specifically for the Tibetan script. So in that sense, it was also used by people at home. Here you can see a detail of some of the conjuncts. Also, the Catholic University of America Press had its own typewriter, which is surprising in a sense that they didn't use any other systems. And I've got some correspondence that which system they used. But it's mainly Michael Hans, a German Tibetologist, who devised his own personal Tibetan typewriter with a smaller type size for Tibetan to actually typewrite his own texts basically and distribute it amongst his university students. Now here was the help of a Swiss typewriter company, and actually to produce the Tibetan keys, the typewriter was sent to Japan in order to map the individual characters to the keys of the Swiss keyboard layout. Now, to make it short again, because I know I've been talking already quite a long time, the research also provides an overview of all the existing 35 different printing types that I studied, and which to my view are at the moment, unless there's some undiscovered ones still available, which is of course possible. So in the research and also in the study, there's a chart that actually shows the exact sizes of each of the individual types to give it like a visual overview. And it also deals with like the early Tibetan digital fonts. Now, I'm not going to go into detail into explaining the development of Tibetan fonts at the moment, but I can't resist to show you the first early dot matrix one that actually was devised for typesetting Tibetan with dot matrix printer, in which each line of the text is really written one by one. it's a little bit more a handwritten typeface. And although you can see some of the details, it's, for being the first Tibetan font, it's quite reasonably done. But it's again Teinhardt's typeface that became a model for very popular system fonts and also other typefaces that were manufactured not only in the US but also in Japan. So the Teinhardt printing type actually continues to live on in different typefaces, like for instance the Tibetan Machine Unifont and other ones, or Kailaisa, one of the system fonts for Mac, which uses Teinhardt as his resource. Of course, there's been lots of developments going on, not only by Tibetans, also by Chinese designers, also by Western designers, also Noto Sans, which has been developed by Toshi, was the first openly available typeface for Tibetan, which was useful. So a lot of Tibetans would have access to freely, openly available fonts. And there's been lots of developments going on at the moment. There's a few workshops happening at the moment, and I really encourage quite a lot of people to come up with new designs, new fonts, not only text faces, but also a lot of display fonts. And it proves to be promising. The workshop, which I'm at the moment conducting together with Toshi and 3T Type in China and Tibet together, because we've got about 31 participants from China in Tibet all together, and they're coming up with interesting and good designs. So I really hope that there's more people making typefaces and fonts for the Tibetan scripts, and that the information can be shared and everything. So thank you everyone who contributed to my research and for me to allow this research to be done. I'm very grateful again that I was able to give this talk and to introduce the book itself. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me.